as Michigan mentioned, I run an organization called Physicians for the Environment, and so I'm going to be speaking from a quite specific point of view of the work we do as a doctors organization. I'm hopeful that it'll have some purchase for you in the work that you do in your own lives. So see this as a kind of case study, if you will, for the sort of political work that you can do in your own homes. I want to talk about, just say a word or two about our organization. If you haven't heard of us, don't worry. We haven't done as good a job as we should have to sort of get the word out about who we are. We have about 4,000 members across Canada, and we work on the intersection of human health and the environment. And we really are advocacy focused. You know, some groups do a lot on education and some specialize in research. We do a little bit of that, but primarily we're about winning legislation. And I think we're quite proud of that's really what we do. We try to pass the strongest possible environmental protection laws. We bring doctors in, and that's what we do. We try to win legislation. I want to just briefly touch on three things. I want to say a little bit about one of the kind of classic campaigns that we worked on. That was an effort to win a ban on lawn pesticides across Ontario. And then I want to talk just very briefly about why I think doctors and also nurses, because we often partner with nurses, why health professionals are good advocates for the environment, why we have a fairly good track record. And then I want to say a couple of words specifically on climate change and where our organization is working on climate change, and maybe more broadly where we could all be working on climate change. So just very briefly, one of our classic campaigns was an effort to ban lawn pesticides across Ontario. You may have heard of this. I hope people have heard of that. If you haven't heard of us, at least you've heard of that piece of work. Prior to last year, you could spray pesticides, quite toxic substances, pretty much wherever you wanted on your lawn, your garden. They used them on hospital lawns. They used them on senior citizens' lawns. It was really quite obscene. That stopped now. As of April 2009, there was a ban brought in by the government of Ontario. It covers the whole province. It's called the Cosmetic Pesticide Ban Act. And it effectively prohibits the sale and use of about 250 toxic products. And it really was quite an exceptional piece of legislation, I think quite an historic event really for all of us. We don't take the full credit by any means. Many groups worked on it, as I'm going to mention. But it really was quite important. One of the reasons was we were really up against the largest agrochemical companies in the world fighting this. I mean, it seemed like we were fighting the little lawn care guys, the weed man, but really we were up against Monsanto and Dow and DuPont, the really most powerful agrochemical firms in the world were trying to stop this because we set a really terrible precedent. I mean, the pesticide legislation that we won is really the best in North America, and in fact, I think it's being noticed around the world. So I want to say a word or two about how we were able to do that. And one of the things we were able to do was build a very credible coalition. And I think this is something we can all take away. And it's not a new or original point, but I think it was a really important point. We worked with other health professionals and other high-profile groups when we went to the Ontario government to say this is what we wanted. So we put together a coalition. We brought in the nurses, the Registered Nurses Association. They represent tens of thousands, and Liz knows this, she's a nurse. They represent tens of thousands of Ontario nurses. And we brought in the Canadian Cancer Society, and there's no health charity, I think, that's more respected than they are. And we brought in the David Suzuki Foundation and the Canadian Environmental Law Association. So when we sat down with Minister Gerritsen, the Ontario Environment Minister, and showed him our wish list, our demands for this piece of legislation, we had some pretty heavy hitters at the table with us. And I still remember Minister Gerritsen, when we handed him our wish list with all our logos on it, and he kind of looked down, and it was like 15, high-profile national organizations, and he looked at it and he said, well, this is one of the most impressive coalitions I've seen in my whole political life. So we were able to do that as a doctors organization. We were able to bring in lots of high-powered heavy hitters to meet with the minister and to ask him for what we wanted in the legislation. At the outset, it was by no means clear that we were going to win a strong piece of legislation. That was really what the debate was about, how strong the legislation would be. The second thing we were able to do on the pesticide issue was have direct access to government. And rightly or wrongly, that's one of the things that we, as a doctors organization, have. It's not a particularly fair world. Every citizen should be able to have access to government. The way it actually works is that if you're a doctors organization or a nurses organization, you do have more access to government. We were able to play on that. So we met, I guess it was 4 or 5 times, directly with the minister on this, and we hashed out with him what this piece of legislation was going to look like. And when the industry brought back objections, we were able to speak directly to the minister and say why we thought their objections were wrong. So that direct access between our doctors and the minister was crucial in winning this. And then we did a whole huge media piece. I mean, the pesticide ban was very controversial. The industry did carpet bombed, I would say, the media with their message of how we were wrong, and we fought back. So here's a couple of things. We did a huge amount of op-eds, and Don was mentioning about the importance of using the media in your campaigns. This is an example of an op-ed that I did for the Toronto Sun, Green Jobs Grow from Ban. And one of the points we made about this is that the pesticide ban wouldn't just be good for human health, but it would also be good for the Ontario economy. And that was a message that had a lot of purchase. This was an op-ed that we did in a medical publication, so a way to involve doctors in our campaign. And the headline says, if you can't read it, Ontarians saying no to lawn pesticides. This was actually an article about some polling that we did, which was another tactic we did. Not original to us by any means, but quite useful. We hired a professional pollster to find out how many Ontarians supported a ban. It was about 70%. And those numbers are sufficient to be able to win something strong when your numbers are 70 or 80% in favor of something. So those were a couple of tactics that we did: the direct access to the minister, the high-profile coalition, the media campaign. Those were some of the things that we did to win that piece of legislation, and I think as a doctors group we were able to do that quite well. Say a word about why I think doctors in general are able to win legislation, not just on pesticides, but in general. One, obviously, is the kind of credibility that they bring. Again, rightly or wrongly, citizens should be able to have just as much credibility. The doctors, when they sit down with decision makers, whether it's a mayor or a minister, tend to have a lot of cachet and purchase with decision makers. One of the things that doctors can do really well is that they can translate science into ordinary language. And in fact, often that's what doctors are doing in their practices. They're taking medical studies, they're taking medical research, and explaining it to patients. And that same skill set can be used very effectively, we have found, in political lobbying. So when we met with mayors, for example, when we were doing community by community pesticide bans, many of these mayors and city councilors didn't have a clue what pesticides were doing to local people. And we would come in, I'm not a doc myself, but my board members, my doctors would come in, and they would show them the science. They would show them the research that says pesticides are causing cancer, and pesticides are causing birth defects, and they're causing neurological illness like Parkinson's disease. And this was an eye-opener. This was a huge eye-opener for many of these elected politicians. It's not their fault. They can't be up on everything. But what our doctors were able to do was to translate the science into ordinary language in a way that made sense to these decision makers, and that was very useful. The third thing, the final thing I think the doctors are able to bring as political advocates is the fact they don't have a financial interest in any of this. So we were up against Monsanto and DuPont and the Weed Man, and those guys all have a clear financial interest. They want to keep selling that stuff for as long as they possibly can. And that saps the credibility of their position. When our doctors speak to a minister or to a mayor or to a city councilor, they're not making money on any of this. In fact, to the extent that they keep the population healthy, in a certain sense, they're cutting into their customer base, if you will. So that gives the docs quite a bit of credibility. They're not making a buck off this. Just want to round out the discussion, then I want to really open it up to your questions. The final thing I want to say a word about is climate change and what we're doing on that. We've had some success in the pesticide issue, but my board wanted to broaden our work, and obviously climate change is, everyone is saying, and I think there's a lot of truth in it, is the defining environmental issue of our age, and perhaps to the end of for as long as humanity exists, it may be the key issue, along with nuclear weapons abolition. So how could we as a doctors organization intervene on the climate change issue? There's many ways, there's many entry points for us in terms of how you start to tackle and roll back climate change. Our view was that we could best do this on the issue of energy. And so we've spent the last year working on what we call the Doctors Renewable Energy Project. We're making a real effort now to ramp up renewables like solar and wind power and phase out coal and nuclear. And it's quite clear, I think, to people why we'd want to do that. I mean, as you know, in Ontario, and we are focused in Ontario, the coal plants that we use to produce electricity are huge sources of greenhouse gases, not to mention acid rain and carcinogens as well. I mean, the impact of the coal plants in Ontario is the same in terms of climate change gases as about 7 million cars. And so there's a really good reason to close the 4 remaining coal-fired generating stations in Ontario. Nuclear power is also very harmful from a climate change point of view, and this is not as well known. If you look at the whole nuclear cycle, right from uranium mining right through to decommissioning a plant, if you look at the whole cycle, it's actually hugely greenhouse gas intensive, because uranium mining is very, very GHG intensive. We can get into the details, but suffice it to say that both coal and nuclear are hugely harmful to the climate. So we're trying to ramp up renewables as much as we can.